Okay, so it's 10 o'clock. I wanted just very briefly welcome everyone here today. I realize participants are still coming in. We will start in just 1 minute's time. I'm going to start with some introductory comments and some announcements and housekeeping. So just 1 more minute and then we will start the event. Okay, I'm going to begin with my introduction. Welcome to the launch event of 2 final reports on COVID-19 and working lives in the UK, looking at inequalities of gender and class. And we're here to learn more about and reflect on the research funded by the UK RI and Health Data UK funded projects conducted by academics from the universities of Nottingham and Warwick, led by Professors Tracy Warren and Claire Lionette, in collaboration with the Women's Budget Group, the leading independent organisation that deals with the impact of policy on women's lives. And this is an exceptional research team who have delivered new and important insights into the impact of the pandemic on women's working lives and gender inequalities. I'm Jennifer Tomlinson. I am the chair today and I've been asked to provide a few introductory remarks about the research in the context of my own work and a funded research project under the same UKRI Rapid Response COVID stream. So over the last year, the team have shown incredible commitment and expertise. They've been the first really to analyse what is probably the most robust data available to us as social scientists. They've been looking at the Understanding Society COVID data, which really kind of gives us quite important insights into working lives and wider societal trends. So there's a project on working class women and the work burden of the pandemic, and also a second project that has looked at the impact of job loss on all women and men in the UK. And this is without doubt much needed, vital and landmark research. I really do think it sets a quality standard for how research on gender and intersectionality should be conducted. I do think that people will look back to this research in future to really take a steer on how to conduct this kind of analysis. And it was so refreshing to see this research funded. When I was writing with Kate Hardy a bid that looks at the impact of COVID on the early years sector and working parents, I had a look to see kind of how many kind of social science projects were being funded that had a defined focus on gender and ethnicity. And as of late May 2020, there were no social science projects focusing on women's experiences of the pandemic and or any that had a gender impact analysis of the pandemic. At the time, there was just one woman-focused study looking at health and pregnancy. I looked back again yesterday to see how many of the UKRI Rapid Response COVID projects funded had a woman or gender focus in their analysis. In the summary of the projects, there were around 25 mentions of women and gender, and just 8 had a woman or gendered focus title. So that really, I think, does give us some indication of how important and vital this research is to document, if you like, the experiences of women, particularly working class women, through the pandemic. The project that focused on unemployment co-funded by the UKRI and the Health Data UK, I thought was really exceptional in showing how important it is to look beyond gender and intersect gender and ethnicity, and not only do that, but to actually break down the minority ethnic categories, because we could see such volatility in their experiences of unemployment and their likelihood of being employed throughout the pandemic. Incredibly important in terms of impact and recommendations there. And I particularly liked the focus, the unapologetic focus on working class women and the work burden through the pandemic. Around a third of working class women, as they categorise them, were likely to experience or be able to access furlough. So they were likely to be furloughed. But those that weren't furloughed had very challenging working conditions and working lives through the pandemic. You know, they were much less likely to experience flexible working, meaning they had a lot of rigidities in their jobs, which made it incredibly difficult, therefore, to combine those jobs with other essential work in the household, notably the care of preschool children and homeschooling. They were much more likely to be frontline essential workers, but often low paid. Yet these are not low skilled jobs. And it really does kind of speak to the data we're collecting on the UKRI Childcare During COVID project. The women we're speaking to, who are absolutely working class women working in early years childcare and education, felt very much that they were indispensable. They were essential workers, yet they were disposable. In January, when the early years were required to stay open to all children, while schools closed to all but as key workers and vulnerable children, those settings became the second most likely place recorded by Track and Trace for transmission of the virus. And the Early Years Alliance estimated that 1 in 10 contracted COVID in January 2021. They were working for very low pay, fractionally above the national minimum wage, no pay progression, almost, no PPE, no vaccine priority, and something we were unaware of until January this year is most were not getting full sick pay. We feel there's a strong misrecognition of work and skills. So the focus on working class women for me was so important in these reports, because their experiences through the pandemic have been incredibly challenging. And I was obviously therefore incredibly pleased to see that urgent funding is required for the early years sector to avoid widespread closures, which would have a huge impact on one's employment, and particularly women in low paid jobs, as one of the recommendations coming from this report. And what I would say in addition to that is it's really important to recognise that these women are also the lifeblood. Working class women are the lifeblood of that sector. And better funding for that sector means better employment conditions and pay for these essential workers. And just a couple of quotes here to just give voices to the working class women that Tracy and Claire and the rest of the Women's Budget Group and the team have so carefully analysed through Understanding Society. We're angry, we feel undervalued, overlooked, vulnerable. We feel it's discriminatory in that it exists because a high percentage of childcare workers are female. They feel expendable and that no one cares. And in terms of the misrecognition of the work they do, I thought this quote was also worth highlighting. And they said, we do the most important work. We nurture children, we provide them with the skills they need to be ready for school and thrive. We make them hopefully into independent children, resilient, who can self-regulate. And I don't think it's perceived as what a lot of society thinks is education. So a little bit more on the project should you wish to visit our website. So again, I just want to add my congratulations and my appreciation to the authors of these reports. I'm really looking forward to hearing more in a moment. Before we do, just a moment to reflect on just a little bit of housekeeping and one announcement. Please use the question and the Q&A function rather than the chat function. We are anticipating maybe 120 people in the room. And we won't be able to answer all questions, but I will do my best with help from the team of the Women's Budget Group to draw and theme the questions. So please use the Q&A function rather than the chat function if you have a question for either the authors of the report, who we'll hear from next, or the panelists. If you have a question that is directed specifically to a member of the research team or a panelist, please do mention that in the question, because that means I can allocate the questions accordingly. Please remain muted. The way that we'll run the event is that we'll be sharing our screens. Whoever isn't speaking will also be muted, and we will not use our video, so you are able to focus on the speakers more effectively. Just one change to the programme. Dr. Mary Ann Stevenson, Director of the Women's Budget Group, can't be with us today. So Dr. Sarah Rees will close the event. And finally, I just want to thank the authors again, the panellists, and all at the Women's Budget Group who have helped organise this event. So time to hand over to the authors. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I'm going to hand over first to Professor Claire Lionette, followed by Professor Tracy Warren, and then Dr. Louis Torres.
Thanks so much for that, Jenny. Tracy's going to be sharing her screen, so I'm going to be giving her instructions. But thank you, Jenny. I'm really looking forward to reading more about your project as well. And thanks to our fantastic panel members today for giving their time on such a horrible day, or it's a horrible day here anyway. So today marks the sort of the end or the formal end of the project, if you like. It's the final workshop. We started this, the first of the two projects, last July, and obviously a lot has happened over the past year, as everybody knows. Because of time, this is a very brief summary of our main findings from the two projects led by Tracy Warren at Nottingham. As Jenny said, I'm going to start. I'll be passing over to Tracy, and Louise is also going to talk as well. So I hope it's not too chaotic. I also live next door to a school, and it sounds like they're doing a sort of drum solo class right next to me. So if there's any noises off, you'll understand why. Next slide, please, Tracy. Okay, so in terms of the background to the project, it's well over a year since, we all know this, since the start of national and regional lockdowns, and there's been a lot of changes going on. There's been big changes to hours of work, big changes to how we work and to where we work. For a lot of us, a lot of people are working from home, for example. We've also had unprecedented issues like long periods of homeschooling when kids were sent home to study at home, and also additional care responsibilities, for example, caring for neighbours or additional family members who might be shielding or quarantining, for example. So our focus in this project is on gender and class, as you can see. So we're looking at paid and unpaid work. In terms of paid work, we look at unemployment and job loss. We look at key working, who's on furlough, changes to working hours, job insecurity, etc. We also looked at finances, so and financial hardship, ability to make ends meet, to pay the bills. And then we look at unpaid labour as well. So we're looking at who does the housework, and also who's doing the childcare and the homeschooling during COVID. And finally, we looked also at some outcomes like psychological well-being using the GHQ. Now, we're not going to talk about that today just because of time issues, but if anyone's interested more in these particular issues, please look at our website, because we've got on there, we've got all our blogs, all our publications to date. We've got our final report on there as well. So that'll hopefully give you a bit more detail on some of these issues. So our main research questions for these projects are: how have women and men fared in their paid and unpaid work? And also, more specifically, are working class women faring worse than middle class women? And also, are they faring worse than working class men during COVID? Next slide, please, Tracy. So we know that there are already existing class inequalities among women in the UK. For example, we know that working class women tend to be concentrated in those 5C job areas. So things like cleaning, catering, cashiering, caring. We know that they're poorly paid. We know that there's high levels of financial insecurity. We also know that working class women are more likely to be in part-time paid work than middle class women, for example, who are more likely to work full-time. We also know that working class women are more likely to work short part-time hours rather than long part-time hours. I can see that Ruth's just putting up the project website on there. We also know that working class women do more unpaid housework and care as well. And also they're less able to afford things like cleaners and nannies. And obviously they're doing those jobs themselves. They tend to be the cleaners and the nannies. So that's just a very brief overview of what we know. I'm now going to pass over to Tracy to talk a bit more about the two projects and the findings. So over to Tracy.
Thanks, Claire. Can you hear me? Yeah. Yeah, cool. Okay, so just briefly, hi everybody, thank you for coming. As you've been hearing, we're drawing on two projects today, and just to stress, both bids for funding and the research which we've carried out has been in close collaboration with the UK Women's Budget Group. So the first project up there, it's led by myself and Lewis, who you'll hear from in a minute, looking at women and men's work before and after the pandemic hit. And that work is carried out joint with Annie Goodviken, who can't be here today. The second project is with Claire and myself and the UK Women's Budget Group, and joint with Ruth Tarlow, who is here. Let me just check. Yeah, just briefly, you heard a little bit about the data that we're going to draw on today. The first project draws in part on the UK labour force survey, which is one of the biggest surveys in the UK around employment circumstances. We're drawing on other data as well, but we're just looking at the LFS today. We're looking at work and workplaces after the pandemic. The second data set you've heard from the others that draws on analysis of the UK household longitudinal study, that was hard to say, and its COVID-19 study, which began in April 2020. And when we're looking at class in this data set, we're looking at national statistics, socio-economic classification, so we can look at semi-routine workers, routine workers, and think about how they compare with other people in work. So I'm going to just hand straight over to Lewis, if that's okay.
Thank you, Tracy. Thank you, Claire. Thank you, everyone, for joining today. Well, digging to the overall results of one of the projects, and basically as an introduction of the more detailed data that Tracy will give you later on. In the first graph you see in the picture basically shows you the unemployment rate for men and women. As you can see, there is an increase in general, an overall increase, particularly from the start of the first lockdown, as you can see there. Now, the increase is not as big if you the peer-to-peer follow more or less the same rate for women. This is similar to previous economic crises in the UK and everywhere else, probably. Tracy, can we go to the next one? Tracy, can we go to the next one? Thank you. The overall trend is not as informative in our view here, particularly because it's hiding a number of other variables and characteristics that are actually quite important in the UK population, and these are related with diversity. One of those diversity characteristics is the comparison between white and minority ethnics. Minority ethnics will include Indian, Pakistani, Asian, Chinese, and so on. But here we are using just a composite index. And when we compare both the white and the minority ethnics, in the case of white unemployment, it remains more or less as considered in the orange, more or less orange line there, while when you go to the violet line for minority ethnic, you will see that the increase is quite important in there. Actually, if you compare in terms of gap, the gap pre-pandemic was around 3%, and the gap post-pandemic is around 5%. So it's an increase of 2% when you think of the two groups. Can we go to the next one? The next slide, please.
I've pressed it.
Now, we try to, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, okay. Yeah, thank you. When we try to figure it out why levels have increased, we try to look redundancies. Redundancy is not an indicator necessarily that will be explaining unemployment. Particularly, we look at the reasons for redundancy. The main reason for redundancy is that employers in general.
I think are we losing Lewis?
Redundancy. Can you hear me?
You're on and off. I can hear you now.
These are the internet. Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just the internet is not working properly. Apologies for that. So as I will be short, so you don't lose me too much. I'm sorry for the internet issues. So as I was saying that basically the main reason for the redundancy here are related with employers letting their staff go. We also said before that this is obviously not explaining unemployment in general, but it's an interesting indicator, particularly considering that this is not getting better after the pandemic, and particularly after, no, well, not after the pandemic, but after the pandemic started, and particularly now that we are supposed to have some level of recovery. Can we go to the next one?
Pressed it.
And just finally, yes, thank you. Again, I'm sorry for the internet. I don't know what is wrong today. Probably the weather. So if when we go more in detail and trying to figure out what happens with the recovery, particularly in terms of employment, we see that when we move the analysis not from unemployment but actually for actual employment levels, we also see that when we compare the different occupational classes, we see that in general employment has remained more or less stable for most occupational classes, but not for those in routinary and semi-routine jobs. And those were the ones we mentioned before, related with frontline and essential work. We have there, for example, cleaners, drivers, shop workers, and so on. So it's interesting to see, particularly how unemployment is going down. Employment is not necessarily recovering for those workers, but it remains more or less stable for the other. This is an interesting finding from my point of view, and I believe Tracy will give you some more details about particularly that area in the next slides. And again, I'm sorry for my internet. I don't know what happened today. Thank you.
It seems to be fixed now. Thanks, Lewis. Okay, just over to me for a chunk of time. What we're going to do now is we're looking at people in employment only. So obviously people in jobs were not unaffected by the pandemic, And we've got an example on figure 5 of this kind of new phenomenon of people who were in jobs but reported doing actually no hours in their jobs. And this is a really classed picture. And certainly if you look at before the pandemic hit, if you look in January, February, then there was very few people who reported this thing. But after April, we kind of saw a real shoot up in the amount of people who said who they're in employment but reported doing 0 hours in their job. And of course, that's a really strongly classed picture here. You can see almost half of those working class women, 45% in April, were working but reported doing no hours in the job. And it stayed, you know, at a decent level into 2020 and 2021. And this phenomenon was, you know, far less prevalent amongst, you know, senior level women there. And of course, a large part of this, not all of it, but a large part of this is about the classing of furlough in the UK. So in figure 6, we can see that working class workers, those yellow columns, were disproportionately more likely to be furloughed than workers in more senior positions, for example, and with men taking over as the year progressed. So you can see, you know, like 34% and 46% of those people in working class jobs compared with far fewer in the more senior positions. What we're interested in as well, as Claire mentioned, we're interested in the financial ramifications of the pandemic. And remember, this is about those people who are still in jobs. And we're interested in who was a low earner. And this is a bit of a support of our focus on working class women. You know, and Jenny was telling us about that earlier. So here, when we look at people who had low weekly earnings, so that's less than 2/3 the median of everybody employed at that time. This is November. I mean, it's very similar for all the months we have, so we've just got November for ease. And what we see in figure 7 is just how gender and class shape who are the lowest earners in the labour market. And we know that weekly earnings, we looked at weekly earnings because they're a combination of hourly pay and how many hours you work a week, of course. And here you can see that accumulation of an hourly disadvantage, which Claire talked about, and also a pay disadvantage for working class women. So you've got, you know, a real chunk of those women are low earners. We can also look at, we can really show you some real class inequalities in the employment conditions experienced by those in paid work. And here, we're interested in which workers have access to quality flexible working arrangements to help them manage the pressures on them. And of course, they were intensified during the pandemic. This is all in the report if people want to look, because I know I'm powering through it a bit fast. But just for example, if you look at that, you know, so few working class women had access to working at home. Far fewer could work their hours informally than senior women could work flexi time, and so real difference in class differences in those employment conditions. What we do here in this kind of summary table, everybody's a bit, I don't think everyone's convinced in the team this is actually a useful summary, so I apologise. But here we've got the kind of block of whether you're on furlough, whether you're a key worker, whether you were doing no hours, and you can see those pluses are show, who's impacted by that. So we've got those kind of pluses in the working class column mostly. If we think about who was working from home, who had access to flexible working arrangements, again, this is a class story, but the positives are there for the middle class workers who are doing better on that. When we get onto finances, so in addition to weekly pay, we show in the report that those working class women, their own low earnings weren't being financially cushioned by a higher earner in the household. Actually, those women who were living with another adult, then they were working in low earning households. Very few working class workers were able to make savings from their income during 2020 than middle class workers, are far less able to build up a financial safety net. And worryingly too, we kind of see increasing levels of reported financial difficulties by working class workers, reporting hardship, reporting it's very difficult to get by. So yeah, that's a kind of speed summary of paid work and finances. What we're going to do now, just for the end, is think about the housework and caring before and during the pandemic hit. So figure 9, so just to tell you about what's going on here. So this is women's responses. We've got men as well in the data. This is only couples who are asked this question. And we see like a really strong gender picture. So those women in employment who are in couples are really sort of saying that they're mostly doing, or always usually doing, these routine household tasks that they're asked about. And the pandemic, rather than narrowing this gender gap, actually intensified it slightly further across all those tasks apart from grocery shopping. So once the pandemic hit. So, you've got 70% of women saying they're doing the washing and ironing, 61% of them doing the cleaning. The rest of that work was mostly being shared. When we look at the men's figure, which I haven't got time to look at today, very few men said it was always or usually them doing it. A similar gender picture when we move on to who was doing the childcare, who was doing the homeschooling. We've got those women, those working women in couples saying that it's mostly them have responsibility, and it increased after the pandemic hit. So in 2018, 2019, you've got 47% of women up to 55%, rather than a narrowing gender gap. And you've got, 59% of women saying, it's mainly me responsible for that homeschooling. It's very gender picture, but you do have some class dimensions going on there. So you've got fewer managerial professional women saying that actually it's me who had main responsibility for housework, homeschooling and childcare. And so we were interested, because we looked at paid work, we're interested in unpaid work. So how were workers managing this, especially in the intense pandemic situation? And this is my last slide. Honestly, I'm going to stop after this one. So figure 10, we're really interested in who reduced their hours because of the time they spent with the kids, who adapted their work schedule. And you can see, very few of our working class women said they did either of them. And we've been writing about this very different classed experience of being an employed mum with the pandemic pressures. So you've got your middle class mums more likely to be at home, adapting their schedules. So it's got positive flexibility in the workplace, but of course that brings its own challenges. Whereas your working class mums were more likely to be going out to their paid jobs and often in key worker roles. So I'm going to hand across to Claire. I think that's the next slide. Yeah.
Thanks, Tracy. So just sort of briefly summing up what has happened during COVID. Well, we've seen in terms of paid and unpaid work, we've seen that men's unemployment rose steeply. The existing ethnicity gap in unemployment has widened. Those class differences in paid working that we'd already seen have deepened. There's been a class gap in employment recovery during 2021. And those existing gender differences in housework have just intensified, as Tracy just showed. In terms of childcare, homeschooling, the responsibilities actually increased. Mothers had the main responsibility. We've known that for years, but there was this sort of optimism that perhaps things might become a little bit more equal with men working from home or being on furlough. And also that fact that middle class women have adapted their paid work more than working class women. And in terms of working at home and flexible working arrangements, working class women are very rarely working from home at all. Few changed their work schedules and few had those, what we would call the positive flexible working arrangements. So sort of summing up, working class women have had the worst of both worlds, which is what we really wanted to look at the beginning. They're less protected than middle class women in their paid work, and they're still doing more unpaid work than working class men. So there's a very sort of gendered and class picture throughout the pandemic. So that's a real whistle-stop tour. As I said, do look at the website. We're now going to pass over to Sarah at the Women's Budget Group, but there will be time for questions on both after Sarah's spoken. So thank you very much for listening.
Yeah, thanks. It was a whistle stop tour, but it was excellent in giving, you know, key oversights of your primary research findings. And yes, we're now going to pass over to Dr. Sarah Rees of the Women's Budget Group. And so building on this first part of the talk, Sarah will introduce the Women's Budget Group data on public opinion, on government response to COVID-19, and the effects of the pandemic on different groups of women, with a particular focus on young women, low income, mothers, and minority ethnic women. Just a reminder that we will have a 20-minute Q&A session after Sarah's presentation, and please do use the Q&A function rather than the chat function to list your questions. That's just for those who have joined slightly later. So I'm going to pass over to Sarah now.
Thank you very much, Jenny. I'm going to share a few slides. Just bear with me a moment. Okay, can you see it? Okay, so thanks very much, Jenny, for the introduction, and for Claire and Louise and Tracy for that whistle-stop tour through the brilliant project on working class women in COVID. So what I'm going to do in my presentation is to kind of focus on some of the impacts that we know that COVID has had on different groups of women beyond the kind of the class divide. So we know about we already know quite a lot about the economic impact of COVID-19 on women, and as the previous speakers presented, so we saw that men's employment, or rather men's unemployment, increased more sharply, although women have been slightly more likely to be furloughed throughout the pandemic. There was the additional work created by school closures, which also fell mostly on women's shoulders. There was also deterioration of mental health for women during the pandemic, which is kind of a consequence of also the economic and other social impacts that women faced. Women have also been a majority of those struggling financially, and those in debt because of the pandemic. And this is really no surprise, I think, since we know about women more likely to be in low-paid work, less likely to own wealth and other assets. And we've also seen an increased impact of femicide and domestic abuse during the pandemic, which has affected women disproportionately. But as we've seen from the previous presentation, so the impact of the pandemic has not really been homogeneous, and in some cases disparities were actually more pronounced along different lines than gender. And as we've just seen, class, as defined by occupation, was a big one. But there were also other kind of dividing lines, and one of them has been income. And we know that income overlaps significantly with class. In some polling work that we at the Women's Budget Group have done with the Forces Society and women's organizations in the devolved nations, we were focusing on parents for that polling work, and we consistently saw lower income families faring the worst when it came to higher furlough rates, being put on furlough for longer, more likely to lose hours and jobs, and lower likelihood of working from home as well. And mothers on lower incomes in particular, they were more likely to have their job affected by school closures. And again, this is a feature of the unequal division of childcare, and also a consequence of the fact that lower paid jobs tend to be more precarious. As we've also seen from Claire, Tracy's and Louis' presentation, key work and low paid jobs significantly overlap as categories. So what we've seen is actually many low paid workers classified as key workers, particularly those in essential retail and those in social care as well, who continue to work outside the house throughout the pandemic. But because of that, they've been at a high risk of infection, but they have been very badly rewarded. And women predominate in both key working and low paid jobs. In addition to this, we have seen how low income families have been struggling financially because they've had to spend more than in pre-pandemic times, something which has actually been the opposite for higher income families who have been able to save money. And this is particularly pronounced amongst families with children. And so some reasons for that, for why lower income families have been having to spend more during the pandemic, have been because it's been more difficult to access things like promotions or cheaper stores. And there were, on top of that, added spending in things like energy, broadband, laptops for homeschooling, and so on. So another kind of dividing line, so this is kind of an infographic about the next dividing line, which is around age. So we've seen while older people have been more affected in health terms by COVID, young people or younger people have been more severely hit economically. And this was mostly because, as we can see in this statistic, young workers were concentrated in shutdown sectors. So things like retail, hospitality, leisure, all of those sectors. And young women in particular, they were affected because they were overrepresented in these sectors. And I think it's also important to mention that when you are hit by an economic recession in your early career years, it has a long-lasting effect well into your professional future, with losses in pay and in career progression compared to if no recession had happened. So another big kind of dividing line when it comes to impacts of COVID economically has been race, and so Louis has already touched on this. You know, there were impacts both in terms of health and also employment terms. So in terms of health, we know that Black women were nearly 3 times more likely to die from COVID than white women. And here exposure played a role, with minority ethnic workers more likely to work in key sectors and therefore high exposure jobs. And minority ethnic workers are also more likely to live in more deprived areas where COVID also hit harder, and they are more likely to live in overcrowded accommodation, which is also a risk for COVID infection. So we've seen from the previous presentation that employment for minority ethnic workers fell more sharply, but this is not explained entirely by overrepresentation of BAME people in shutdown sectors, because even within these sectors, workers from ethnic minorities were made redundant at higher rates than their white peers. So there is something else going on here than just the impact of COVID on these sectors. So another big kind of dividing line when it comes to the impacts of COVID has been disability. And again, here, the impacts have both been on health and in economic terms. So on health in 2020, disabled women were 3.5 times more likely to die of COVID than non-disabled women. And economically, they have been one of the hardest hit groups too. So early in the crisis, from some polling work that we did at WBG, we found that over a third of disabled women reported not having, or rather their household had already run out of money. And this is compared with a quarter of non-disabled women. And when we look at mothers specifically, again, from a polling survey we did in November last year, we found that a half of respondents who were disabled mothers had been put on furlough, compared to a third of non-disabled mothers. And so the kind of the last dividing line that I wanted to focus on my presentation is motherhood, or parenthood, or motherhood more specifically. This is mostly to do with the extra unpaid work created by school closures, which affected particularly mothers' ability to do their jobs, as it really already did before the pandemic hit. But because of the nature of the pandemic and the nature of the measures that were introduced to try to contain it, the complex scaffolding built around mothers' jobs, so a combination of flexible working, informal childcare by grandparents, and formal childcare provision, it all collapsed because of the measures to contain the virus. And so we know that unpaid work increased, parents' time spent on childcare increased, and fathers also started doing much more than they were doing before, but obviously from a lower base than mothers. So it was really mothers who absorbed the bulk of the extra childcare, the homeschooling, and the domestic work generated by family being home all day. And as we've seen in the previous presentation, class also has an impact here, because working class women tend to absorb the most of this extra childcare themselves. And then, of course, this extra unpaid work has a knock-on effect on paid work. So we've seen very early on in the pandemic that mothers had less uninterrupted time when they were working from home, and we've seen that nearly half of the mothers who were made redundant during the pandemic cited the lack of adequate childcare provision as the reason. So caring responsibilities was a reason for employers to put employees on furlough, but it was kind of fairly poorly known and not as widely offered as an option as it arguably should have been. Single mothers were particularly badly hit. So they were the group that lost the most working hours during COVID. They were 3 times more likely to have had to rely on food banks than mothers in couples. So one last, so these are some of the stats that I mentioned. One of the last things that I would like to mention before I wrap up, it's really the attitudes to the government response when it comes to COVID-19. So again, we did some polling work with the Forces Society and some women's organizations in the devolved nations to understand how women in different parts of the UK were thought about the government's response to COVID-19. And I think truly it's no wonder that women feel they have been forgotten in the pandemic response. And we found that only 1 in 4 think that the government's response was addressing the issues that matter to them. And I think it's very telling also to see that the rate is the lowest when it comes to agreeing that the government is responding to what matters to them. The rate of the women who agree with this is lowest among the groups that were hardest hit during the pandemic, like young women, women in low incomes, disabled women, and single women in particular. So just to finish, the pandemic affected women disproportionately when it comes to their economic and social position, and in particular their mental health too. But the experience of COVID has really not been equal across all women, and we have some dividing lines that are particularly significant when it comes to these disparate impacts. So low income, disability, young age, and motherhood are all significant factors when it comes to a negative experience of COVID. So that's me. I'm going to hand over to Jenny for the discussion.
Hello, hi, thanks for that, Sarah. Some really important insights here again in relation to kind of public perception of how the government have dealt with the pandemic. So the question and answer option is available to everybody who's here. There's been some questions kind of coming through that have been dealt with by the authors of the report and the Women's Budget Group. I'm just having a look, see what we have coming in now, but please do put your questions up and I can look at them and ask them of the authors of the report with the Women's Budget Group. Is one question from Jennifer Churchill. It asks, is it worth considering the ongoing hit of lost hours, for example, through falling out of auto-enrollment criteria for pension saving? I don't know if that's anything that's been looked at all in these reports.
We haven't looked at pensions in particular in our research. Sarah, have you in WBG?
No, we haven't, but I think that's an excellent question, and I think our suspicion is that it has gotten worse, and that there is that danger that women who are being affected now by the loss of hours, by by being put on furlough, all of those things, they will have that will have an impact on the pension that they will receive later on in life. And we already know that there is a huge gender pension gap, particularly when it comes to private pensions, between difference between women and men, and so this has the potential to actually widen those differences.
And then there's a question from Suze Bentley, who's asked, who said, we've seen that middle-class women made redundant often decided to start their own businesses. Was a question on entrepreneurship or freelancing asked of working class women, which I assume would be whether there's a question on that in Understanding Society, Tracy?
We have, Claire knows the whole conversation we had around what to do about the self-employed in our analysis. As we've been talking, those people were in employment, and so in the project we don't in our report we don't actually focus on the self-employed in general, but we have, hold on, one moment, we have analysed them, but we haven't reported on them yet, and they have had some of the most dreadful time of all workers. And that's true, isn't it, Claire? So, they just stand out.
Yeah, I think that's something, not to sort of fudge it a bit, but I think that's something we're going to look at in the future from this data, because they seem so atypical. There seem to be, it was really up and down their data. So we really wanted to sort of have a look at them almost separately, because obviously there's going to be different reasons of these people who have gone into self-employment because they've had to. Are they, you know, are they running large businesses where they're sort of having to furlough their own workers? Are they just a single person sort of outfit, you know? So I think there's a lot really to sort of, you know, have a look at in that data, but we really felt that they weren't really comparable. Well, I think we have included them in some of the figures, but I think they just didn't seem very comparable with the employees, the paid employees. So the next steps, I suppose.
Yeah, as Suze is saying about people on furlough, whether they thought about self-employment. I mean, obviously people are asked pretty much every month, and we can look more at what's happening to the people who are on furlough and what they did afterwards. Yeah, we haven't done that yet, Suze. We've got good idea though.
Okay, another question. Not sure again if you'll be able to answer this. It's from Alison Parkin. The TUC research quoted 7 in 10 mothers were denied furlough in the most recent lockdown. Do we know mothers' job losses between March and July 2020? What do we know about mothers' job losses between March and July 2020 before the government made it clear that you could request furlough for looking after children when nurseries and schools were closed? I don't know if you know that, but I did think it was actually quite an interesting question to put to you as a team.
I don't know if Sarah's got anything to say on this. Lewis and IR project is ongoing, isn't it? So in terms of big numbers, each kind of quarter, the data sets that we're looking at would be able to help us, because I think, Lewis, in our findings so far, we haven't split it into mothers yet, haven't we not? But it's certainly something we could do.
Yeah, probably this is something we will do in the next reports. We still have a couple more of reports to develop, and probably this is something we are going to include the two.
Lost him again. Sarah?
So we in terms of the polling that we conducted, the different kind of rounds of polling that we conduct throughout the pandemic, it's been clear that mothers have been more likely to be put on furlough than women who don't have any children. So there has been an impact there as well when it comes to motherhood and job losses or redundant or actually furlough.
Okay, there's another question that says it's directed to Claire mostly, but it's about early years, and the question asks, did the ECE, early childhood education and care workers you spoke to see themselves as key workers? From the Understanding Society COVID survey, it looks like there's a significant proportion of workers in education who can't work from home, but nevertheless don't describe themselves as key workers, which I was puzzled by. I wondered whether this could be early years workers. Because
that question for you, Jenny?
I was thinking it might be a question.
I'm thinking, do you mind if I take the question as the chair?
Go ahead.
I think that's probably correct. The early years workers we spoke to felt that they were, if you like, excluded from much of the conversations around education under the Department for Education, despite actually kind of having a curriculum and being officered and inspected and clearly being part of education. And they felt that they were actually not recognised as key and essential workers, despite doing key and essential work. And actually, that was quite an emotive point for them. That they were saying, people in care homes getting vaccines, and they're getting, they're able to kind of get into supermarkets and simple things like discounts. They've never once seen anything that kind of recognised them as essential key workers through the pandemic. And it wasn't about kind of getting clapped, but it was about recognising the essential and quite frankly dangerous work they were doing. Because when you're working with small children, you're working with bodily fluids, and you know, that they weren't really able to wear PPE, and they weren't on the priority list for vaccines, so that they were being infected regularly. So absolutely, this could be one of the reasons that they knew they were essential workers, but they felt that they weren't recognised as essential workers. And yes, so I think there were those added issues there around recognition, for sure. I don't look to have any further questions coming in. Yeah, there are a couple here. So we have a question which I think might be best directed to Sarah, the Women's Budget Group. Do you have any advice for women who feel they have been discriminated against based on maternity leave or pregnancy during the pandemic? What do you feel are the main deterrents why they don't pursue cases against their employers?
Well, I think there are two main cases. Pregnancy and, you know, early or new motherhood are very difficult and can be hard stages in a woman's life. So many women will not feel like they can pursue on top of that, on top of how, you know, motherhood changes your life. They may not feel that they are capable of on top of that also pursuing a tribunal case against their employer, and so they don't really take those discrimination cases forward. And another is often also the cost, not just in financial terms, but also, you know, in terms of time and in terms of emotional and costs that can have an impact on their well-being and on their families. But if the question was particularly on what women should do if they feel like they've been discriminated, there are at least a couple of organizations who provide direct support to women in these circumstances. So I can think about Pregnant Then Screwed and Maternity Action, which are two brilliant organizations who provide advice, support to women in these circumstances on what they can do, and so that will be a case of contacting those organizations and see what will be the next steps.
And we know we've got Nikki from TUC on later as well, so you know she's expert.
Yeah, sure. I mean, and a related question is one from Karen Carberry, who asks what the authors feel the impact of the pandemic will have in terms of challenging sexist attitudes to the workplace, towards the value of women in employment and across society.
Just briefly, I mean, you know, this project and probably your project as well, Jenny, that, you know, one of the main briefs was really to get our findings out there and get it taken up by the press, and it's been quite good for that. The Women's Budget Group are absolutely fantastic at disseminating findings. They've been amazing. Marianne and Sarah have been great at you know, and I think it's only when this stuff gets out there and it gets into the mainstream that people actually start to think about it. That's a bit simplistic, but the other thing, of course, is in the flexible working issue. And as long as, you know, flexible working is seen as a women's issue, it's always just, you know, work-life balance and flexible working. How many times we've seen this over the years that, oh, that's just a women's thing, women with kids, you know. And I think actually the pandemic has really highlighted, even though not everybody, as we've shown, can work from home, that, you know, men can work from home quite successfully, and it can be really advantageous for them and for their kids and for their partners as well. So, you know, once perhaps those kinds of changes, those longer term changes, maybe just maybe there might be a little bit of change in terms of attitudes in the workplace, but maybe I'm being very optimistic.
I'm really glad. I'm just doing a quick plug for the panel later. Obviously, we've got a really great panel coming up later, and one of our participants is doing research in the Netherlands, so we, kind of interesting to think about, how a different society is dealing with the pandemic and gender there.
I would just like to add to Claire's optimism with an observation that, even though we know that women pre-pandemic were doing most of the unpaid work and childcare, and this has really continued after the pandemic, it's also true that fathers in particular started doing much more when it comes to childcare and also homeschooling. And so I think there's also a hope that some of these patterns of men being more involved in their children's lives and their kind of daily care will continue post-pandemic, because I think we have some evidence that when fathers have long periods of engagement in childcare, it's more likely that it continues. And so that's kind of, I think, one hope that a positive change that the pandemic might have brought.
Just a quick add-on, Claire did some really nice work around the impact of the recession, and as she talked about flexibility and how, just doing it can make it seem, Claire, I'm probably just talking crap about your research, can show so families as well as bosses, how things actually can. You sort of did that, didn't you? Before?
It's true, and it's challenging. It's not challenging, it's just getting the managers on board, line managers and employers on board, and showing them that actually it's not the end of the world. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about working from home, isn't there? And, and actually this has been a sort of enforced situation. So everyone's had to have a go, if you like. Well, not everyone, but, those sort of, like we said, the middle class jobs at the very least, everyone's had to have a go, and managers have had to deal with it for good and bad, all these Zoom meetings and Teams meetings. But, I think it's only when they actually have a go that they realize it's possible, and it works. It can work for everybody. I think we've still got the issue there about, that's a class thing as well. Not everybody can work from home. There are ways, things can become more flexible, of course. I think Time-Wise has done some great stuff on this, challenging these attitudes that, for example, workers in the NHS can't work flexibly, but, I think there are ways around it. It might not be working from home permanently, but it might be having a more flexible attitude to people's requests, and more sort of, team working around requests, so everyone's involved, that kind of thing. We did some work for the Government Inequalities Office and on this. So, I think this pandemic has kind of forced us into that situation and has forced us to ask those questions. So, let's see what happens. Let's try and be optimistic.
And like, Claire said, Time-Wise, you've got Women's Budget Group doing amazing work. I think I can see Sarah Dauncey from Working Families on the participant list as well. They're doing really good work around it. So it's really sort of strong campaigning organisations. I was just wondering what Karen Carberry thought, whether she was positive as well, because she threw the question at us. I'm
just going to unmute myself. We are at 11:10, which is exactly the time we said we'd take a 10-minute break. So thanks to the authors of the reports for keeping to time so well, and thanks to the questions that have come in. There are no further questions at the moment in the Q&A. Can I suggest that we do take the 10-minute break that we have scheduled and return in 10 minutes, where we'll have the panel and then a further Q&A session. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Jenny.
Jenny, your sound just went a bit weird then.
Oh dear.
It was for me. It was just a little bit crackly. I don't know. Hopefully that will sort itself out.
Okay, hope so.
Thank you.
And they have been asked to draw on and reflect on the findings of the report in relation to their specific field or sector. So, first of all, we have Dr. Mara Yerkes from Utrecht University speaking to us. So I'm going to mute myself, take myself off video and hand over to you, Mara.
Great, thanks very much, Jenny, and happy to be here with all of you this morning. And so I'm working as a social scientist at Utrecht University, and I do research comparatively on social policies and the ways in which governments and employers and local governments provide policies that help people across a myriad of things, primarily around work, family, and work-life balance. And I study social inequalities, particularly those inequalities related to gender and sexuality and generational differences, and to some extent as well looking at class. And so I currently have two research projects going, one that's looking at gender inequalities and work-life balance in comparative perspective across Europe. And that project was actually ongoing when the COVID pandemic hit, so we're actually picking up a bit of that. But I'm also the principal investigator on another major project we've developed here in the Netherlands called COGIS-NL, which is the COVID Gender Inequality Survey Netherlands. And we've been following parents throughout the pandemic and also people without children under the age of 18 in the home. And so I was really excited when Tracy invited me to come here, and I'm really happy to have been here today. And I really read both of the reports with great interest because I think the studies as they're being presented from Tracy and Claire and Louise and Sarah's findings from the Women's Budget Group are so crucial for understanding the impact of the pandemic on men and women, not only in the UK, but also for other countries, because we're particularly looking to contextualize findings as we're moving forward. So I guess I'd like to focus my comments on a few aspects that I was most intrigued about. Again, noting that I'm coming from a more international perspective or an international view on gender inequalities, and the Dutch view in particular, despite coming from the United States originally myself. And so looking at the impact of the pandemic on men and women in relation to paid work, care, and well-being. So first, I'd like to note that I really appreciated the longitudinal approach to both of these to the studies, because much of the evidence coming out now around the pandemic tends to be cross-sectional, that is just this one-time look at a particular aspect. But as the results from Tracy and Claire and Louise show, we really need to be studying this across time. Having evidence of the first lockdown is really important for us to understand the immediate impact of the pandemic. And I don't think that many of us imagined the pandemic would last as long as it has. But as we've gone forward, we really need these longitudinal representative data that tell us what's going on and how the pandemic is impacting men and women in very dynamic ways. Second, and in line with Jenny's comments in the opening of this meeting, I really appreciate what we academics call the intersectional lens, because I think you've given particular attention to the way in which this case, gender, is intersecting with other meaningful identities, such as class and ethnic minority status. And I'd really be interested at some point in hearing more about the differences found across ethnic minority groups of men and women in the UK, particularly related to job loss. So for example, I'd be interested in hearing more about whether you have a sense of what explains the differential unemployment rates among Pakistani, Bangladeshi, and Chinese groups. And part of that is just because the ethnic minority groups are so different across various international contexts, and I'd be interested in hearing about that more. And I know that at least in the Netherlands and other contexts, some of my colleagues have been doing research on the stigma that people with an Asian, I'm sorry, I'm switching from Dutch to English in my head, but people with an Asian appearance are actually facing stigma here in the Netherlands, and that has potentially also impacted their employment. I'd be intrigued about hearing about that. In terms of that, along these, the crucial longitudinal and intersectional perspectives, from an international lens, I actually would like to touch on a few of the findings. And the first is that I'm really intrigued by the fall in the employment rate among working class employees in key occupations in particular, noted in the report on job loss, and the decline in work hours in the second report. because this finding actually differs with the Dutch case, where we found that those parents, at least working in essential occupations or key occupations, as you call them, worked more throughout the pandemic. And so I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on why, despite their overrepresentation in key occupations, working class women were hit so hard by both job loss and reduction in working hours. And perhaps, even though, as you note, that very few working class women reported changing their working hours. So some of them are seeing this shift from hours to 0 hours, and others are actually not reporting a change at all. And that's intriguing to me. A second finding I was thinking about was the working from home issue. And I really appreciate the clear findings here on how working from home differs across gender and class. So in the Netherlands, I find that the discussions are oftentimes around all these ideas around working from home. And we've been very careful to say, but the working from home is not the experience of all workers in the pandemic. And we found a very similar dichotomy across class. And in this case, for us, we measured it using educational levels, but that workers working from home were generally higher educated public sector workers, whereas lower and middle educated workers were working on location, as we called it. And we found really significant differences in the level of autonomy that workers have to actually choose where they're working from. And I think this is a crucial aspect as we're moving forward and talking about employers, given the particular role of employers in the UK, that many of these workers don't have the same levels of autonomy when engaging with flexible work arrangements or other options. I also thought it was really interesting to think about the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on women and mothers in particular. And the discussions around this, so the fact that mothers were doing more than fathers, both in terms of housework and care work prior to the pandemic and still are, this is very similar to the Netherlands. So we also saw here that the relative division of who does more or less was very gender unequal prior to the pandemic and still is. However, as Sarah noted, we also found a similar change in some fathers' role in care work. So initially we found during the first lockdown that 22% of fathers indicated doing more care work than they had done before. And this actually shot up in June to 31% and then started to decline. And at our last measurement in November of 2020, we found that this had actually declined to 18% of fathers. So for both of these countries, from a long-term perspective, there's been, I think, some shifts in this, but it could suggest that for some fathers, this change in gender roles might be developing. And this is pointing to the discussion between Claire and Sarah and others. And so you could take this optimistic view. However, despite the fact that I'm an eternal optimist and I always see the glass as half full, another finding of ours actually would suggest that this is quite different. We asked, after our first wave of data collection, we were in contact with policymakers and knowledge institutions, etc. And one of them said, it's great that dads are doing more, but are they actually happy about it? So we added a question to our survey around people's satisfaction with the divisions of care work, housework, etc. And what we're finding is that if you look across time, fathers' role in care work was increasing and is now going back towards more pre-pandemic levels. And both mothers' and fathers' satisfaction with the division of care is actually increasing. So in November, when it had actually declined down to 18%, we're actually seeing the highest grade that parents are giving their satisfaction with the division of care. And from a social justice perspective and research around the distributive justice aspects, we know that many women and mothers in particular tend to perceive very unequal situations as fair, and that this can be a barrier to actually achieving more gender inequality in the long run. So I think we want to be aware of these aspects as we're trying to understand the dynamics of intersectional gender inequalities in moving forward. So to round out my comments, I'd actually like to say a bit more about that moving forward from more of a policy perspective, because I think these findings are particularly important as policymakers and employers are looking towards this post-COVID future and new ways of working. For example, and as I noticed, a lot of policy discussions tend to revolve around questions of whether we will continue to work from home or the prevalence of hybrid working. But clearly, if we look at these findings, we need to be considering the large group of workers that are not in hybrid work situations and never will be, because many of them are simply unable to work from home. Moreover, I think that the finding that women in ancillary and support roles were more likely to face redundancy is a really crucial one to keep in mind when moving forward. because these changing ways of working, if these, middle management professional people are changing the way in which support staff work, and if they're not coming to the office as much, this could potentially have more significant and longer term impacts on women more than men, and among working class women in particular. And I think another issue to keep in mind, and a particular challenge for policymakers and employers, is the diversity of experiences and how the pandemic is affecting people's working lives and their home lives. And I think that these findings really highlight the importance of understanding how the pandemic affects individuals in intersectional ways, as mentioned by many of you. And in moving forward, I'm wondering what this intersectional lens can tell us about the particular challenges faced by different groups, working class, ethnic minority groups across different genders. And how do these intersections of gender, class, and ethnic minorities background create potentially unique challenges for different groups as we're moving forward from the pandemic? And I'll stop there for now. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm coming back. Can people hear me clearly now? I know there was some problems. Oh, that's good news. So I'll repeat a little bit of what I said before I introduced, or tried to introduce, Mara, and that is that the panelists are reflecting on the report and those key findings in relation to their expertise within their field or sector. So next we have Mandu Reid, who is from the Women's Equality Party. I'll hand over to you now. I'll come back visually at 10 minutes. Thanks.
Okay. Can you hear me nice and clearly? Yes. Okay, fantastic. Now, my notes are actually on my screen, so forgive me if my eye contact is a little bit skew as I'm speaking to you. First of all, I want to say thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me and giving me the chance to speak to you today. And thank you because everyone on this panel, and I'm sure people in the audience as well, all of your work is so important. You are telling the story of women's lives, stories that don't get told often enough. I am the leader of the Women's Equality Party. We are the first and only feminist political party in the UK. I'm the first person of colour to lead a national political party in British history. And absolutely, the year and a half that we've just had has been seismic. Seismic politically, but seismic for so many women in very visceral, very real, very tangible ways. And so what I'm going to do in the time I have allotted is tell a story. And I think some of what I'm going to do, Mara, you'll be pleased. It's an attempt to bring to life how some of this is manifested for real women in a longitudinal way across time. And I hope it also helps to illuminate some of the lines of inquiry that Mara presented. And so I will be telling you a story of somebody who has actually lived a lot of what the reports that we're discussing today have kind of highlighted and brought to the fore. So as we have seen, the pandemic has raised the stakes. For too many people, particularly working class people, there is a thin line between getting by and going under. What we've seen from these reports and other evidence that has emerged is that for women, that line is even thinner, particularly working class women. And so, staying optimistic, energized, and organized in the face of such turbulence and uncertainty can feel like a monumental task. But it is central to my work with the Women's Equality Party. It is central to the work that unions and others who are organizing on the ground and campaigning are trying to do, and a spirit that they need to uphold. Now, when I read the reports, they reminded me of Aya. And I'm going to tell you Aya's story. Aya is a member of the Women's Equality Party. She just happens to be. That's how I know her. She is a single parent with two beautifully curious and endlessly energetic children. They live in a 2-bedroom flat perched at the top, of 5 flights of stairs, which was a logistical nightmare when the kids were tiny. But Aya never complained because she was grateful to have somewhere to live after her husband left them. She never complained, even though she once heard her neighbors talking about how immigrants were taking housing away from people who were born and bred here. Aya used to work as a nurse. She loved her job, but she had to stop working when the second child came along because there was no way she could afford the childcare. When the older one started school and the youngest got some free hours at nursery, she got a job at the local supermarket. The people were nice, and she was mostly able to work evening shifts while her mom looked after the children. Her wages just about covered her rent and bills. And between her mom's pension and the benefits they tried to, and her benefits, they tried to cobble the rest together. She was exhausted and she was broke, but she somehow kept going. Now, when COVID struck, everything changed. Because Aya was an essential worker, her kids could stay in school and in childcare, but the little one was moved to a different nursery, which meant they now had to take the bus to get to the nursery. Aya's mom moved into their flat to help, but they decided that it was too dangerous for her because Aya and the kids were mixing with other households every single day. So Aya asked her boss if she could be furloughed, but she was told that that wasn't possible because they were too busy to be understaffed. Instead, they let her switch to daytime shifts so that she could look after the kids in the evening. And so she cut back her hours as well to fill the gaps in childcare. When she got a fever, she didn't tell anyone. But the reduced working hours quickly caught up with Aya. There was no wriggle room for her to take a cut in her wages. She couldn't get to work on time after dropping off the kids, and she couldn't make it back in time to pick them up. The youngest wasn't settling well into the new nursery, and when he got sick, Aya had to stay at home. She was exhausted and she was broke. We've heard that before already, but now she was also terrified about what would happen if she caught COVID. She couldn't keep going, so she quit her job. Now, I am sharing this story with you because I want us to remember that behind the rich data in these reports, there are thousands of women struggling in poverty. It's not an abstract thing. It's not numbers on a spreadsheet. It's a very real, very visceral, very day-to-day experience. I'm sharing this because I want us to recognize that it was always impossible or virtually impossible for single parents and for working class women to stay afloat and have a good quality of life whilst maintaining their well-being, et cetera, et cetera. And so if we design an economy where some people live on the edge, then it actually takes much less than a pandemic to push them over it. We have survived this pandemic on the backs of women. Women who put themselves at risk. So we, and I'm talking about middle-class families, didn't have to in the same way. Women who cared for others while our government did not care for them. Women who will continue to pay the price if we don't do something. They will continue to pay the price for years to come. We have turned that into a sort of narrative of country first, a national effort, a sort of jingoistic narrative. But these women did not get a choice about whether or not they would be heroes. And the thing that frightens me most about these reports is that they actually confirm what we already knew. It didn't take feminist economists or the women's sector long to work out what this pandemic would mean for women. And that means our government knew too, at least on some level. I mean, I could recite a speech for you that I gave last year at our party conference in October, where I was calling for many of the things that these reports recommend. And to be perfectly honest with you, when I look back on the past year, I can't escape feeling a sense of shame. Now, don't get me wrong, we fought like hell and we made some progress, vital progress on ensuring, for example, that parents could be furloughed for childcare reasons. It took a while to get there, but we got there. free school meals. We arranged and campaigned and fought for breastfeeding and pregnant women to have a right to a vaccine and vaccine priority. We challenged local authorities over their duty of care. And we got emergency funding to organizations that tackle violence against women and girls. So we should celebrate those things. Those things are super important, but let's also be real. We haven't yet changed the structures that got us here in the first place. And the signs aren't as promising as I'd like them to be. And the calls from actually across the political spectrum are not as loud as I would like them to be in relation to recognizing the structural genesis of the problems that I've described via Aya's story and that these reports tell in very rigorous detail. We need sustainable funding for refugees. We need increased child benefits so that families can afford every meal. We need a real living wage for care workers and free universal childcare. We need all these things to end the cycle of poverty that disproportionately affects women, that disproportionately affects single parent households that we know are led by women in the overwhelming majority. 90% of single parent households in this country are led by women. Now, Aya's story has stuck with me through the pandemic, but it's actually the story of so many women. And it's the reason why we created a Women's Equality Party. Her name, Aya, it means amazing or miracle. And she certainly is both, but she shouldn't need to be either to survive in this world. Her name also means verse or chapter. And I believe it's incumbent on all of us, academics, activists, ordinary people. It's incumbent on all of us to be part of writing a new chapter. One with her, one for her, and for the thousands and thousands of women struggling and wrestling with the experience that she's had. And it's not going to surprise you to hear this from me, but I believe that that means we have to take what we know, what our findings tell us is needed, into the political space. It's good to talk amongst ourselves, but we as individuals don't wield the power or hold the levers that can manifest this stuff into reality. We've got to be unafraid to push for these things, unafraid to recognize how political this is. But we do have a chance to do that. The latest agreement, for example, between G7 nations on corporation tax, it's far from perfect, but it's a recognition that tax reform is needed. Because of the pandemic, there is a new consciousness around care. I mean, even men get it to a better degree than they used to 2 years ago. We can build on that. Job creation is a chance to tackle occupational segregation. And these are just some of the things that kind of give me hope and optimism. These are just some of the things that I believe give us a platform and a foundation to lift the words off the paper of these reports and put them into practice, to write a new story that would change things for the thousands and thousands of women who are dealing with the reality that these reports so kind of viscerally, eloquently describe.
Thank you so much. I mean, such a compelling and passionate statement there. And I'm sure we're going to come back actually after we've heard from the other panelists to discuss the recommendations from this report and making sure that there is impact. So now I'd like to hand over to Professor Rob MacDonald, who is at the University of Huddersfield.
Hi, can you hear me okay? Well, first thing I would say is I wish I didn't have to follow Mandu. That was superb, so thank you very much. Like Mandu, I've got some notes on my screen, so my eye contact might not be quite right. Normally I use PowerPoints, but I thought I'll give that a miss today. It's Friday afternoon, very nearly. It's sunny. Well, up here it is anyway. So I'll be brief. Firstly, thanks to Tracy, Claire, and the team. I've known Tracy for many years now, and I've always been struck and impressed by the power of her research to throw such a sharp spotlight on the way that class and gender so powerfully shape our everyday lives. So I'm very pleased to be here. I did ask Tracy though, well, what is a discussant? Well, I'm not really quite sure what that role is. And she said, I'll just check, try not to slag us off too much, possibly slip in one or two nice comments, and you can have 1 minute tops, I think that was in capital letters, 1 minute tops to talk about your own research. So for the next 5 or 6 minutes, I'm going to be talking about some research that I've done with colleagues in the northeast of England. No, that's a joke. What I'm going to do is talk briefly about our own research, and then try to draw out some, comparisons of things that the research here today made me think about, and raise 1 or 2 questions. So yeah, over the past year or so with Hannah King and Emma Murphy at Durham University, we've been doing research about young people's experience of the pandemic and of lockdown. Youth research is one of my things, as well as researching labour market issues, informal economy and so forth. Youth research has been one of my main avenues over a number of years now. And we were struck by how in political and media commentary, young people were talked about a lot, but were rarely talked to. They were never consulted, not even about important things like what happens with disrupted exam qualifications and so forth. There was the usual tropes of young people as being vulnerable and in trouble, and young people being trouble and being super spreaders and the rest of it. But young people's own voices and experiences were largely absent. So we launched a survey, an online survey of young people aged 14 to 30 in the northeast of England. It's just a short, simple thing. We were working with youth work agencies as well, because we wanted our research to have some value and have some use to people and agencies that work with youth. And we were chuffed. We got about 1,000 people replying to us, young people who replied to the survey. We didn't quite expect that to happen, but I think it showed maybe that there was some appetite on behalf of young people to have their say. And there was enough spread in terms of numbers, in terms of gender, in terms of ethnicity, in terms of where in the north people were from, in terms of their status or their occupation or what they were mainly doing at the time, and in terms of their age within the 14 to 30 range, for us to feel confident that we were able to say some things that are fair and reasonable about young people's experiences. So just very quickly, what were some of the main headlines or findings? Well, the single item that young people talked about the most was what we describe as a sense of ill-being, not well-being, ill-being. Mental distress, anxiety, depression, lack of routine, getting lost in structureless Netflix days with nothing to do and a sense of lack of purpose. Linked to growing feelings of insecurity and worry about disrupted education and educational milestones, the loss of jobs and worry about income and household income, and the worry about future work possibilities. And there were some hints at class inequalities in experience, but I'll come back to that in a little while. We're currently investigating some of those themes and issues further in one-to-one interviews with young people and with youth work practitioners. And one of the things I would say is that is interesting is that in examining research from elsewhere in the UK and from international partners and colleagues, some of the things we're finding and are saying are very similar to what's being said and found in other places. So back to the research today. This report about working class women's experiences show how tough things have been, how tough things are for working class women in respect of the labour market and work in the domestic economy. It spells out in graphic terms the combination of pressures and experiences faced by working class women. And I've tried to pinpoint, 13 examples. I made a list to try and get it straight in my head, and I hope I have got it straight, colleagues. 13 examples of how crap it has been, or if you want to call it 13 points of inequality. So if you're an employed working class woman, compared with men and compared with middle class women, you're most or more likely to, 1, have gone to a situation of working no hours, with working class men to be more often furloughed Thirdly, to be key workers, and to be key workers who worked in frontline and risky occupations. To have been unable to work from home and to end up doing much more housework and more childcare and more homeschooling, and to have had inflexible working arrangements and the lowest wages. And if you're in a household with another worker, your household is going to be one of the households with the lowest earnings. You are going to have had the highest levels of psychological distress, and over time, as time has progressed, some of the lowest levels of life satisfaction. 13 points of disadvantage and inequality. So all in all, working class women have had a pretty shit time of it. But probably to stress, the way that are phrased that implies that this is something new. And as researchers and commentators today have made the point, this isn't about news, it's about the continuation of inequalities and the deepening of inequalities. So what things might I say in terms of similarities between the research today and our own research? Well, what I would say is that also a very depressing tale could be told about how young people have fared during the pandemic. If we take the report today about unemployment, one of the things that really stood out for me was actually the relatively low level of overall unemployment in the UK, at least in historic terms, and the relatively small overall increases in unemployment that the report shows, going from roughly 4% to roughly 5%. Lewis earlier made the point about how this overall unemployment rate probably doesn't tell us very much. We need to dig a bit deeper. So if you look at the figures for age that are in the report, if you compare that overall unemployment rate of up to 5%, young men last summer were looking at an unemployment rate of about 17% and 12% for young men. So there's a massive disparity or inequality here by age, as mentioned by Sarah earlier. The ILO in a report this month talked about how this means, and this all spells a global crisis for youth. And how the pandemic has hit young people worse than any other age group, with a drop in employment of 8.7% over the previous year, compared to 3.7% drop in employment for adults. And there's a litany and list of figures we can quote. So according to the Office for National Statistics, 25 to 34-year-olds have faced the biggest risk of redundancy. The Resolution Foundation reports that for young people aged 18 to 24 who weren't full-time students, 1/3 of this age group has been furloughed or lost their main jobs. 1/3 of 18 to 24-year-olds who aren't full-time students have lost their jobs or been furloughed, compared to 15% of 35 to 44-year-olds. Young adults are the age group most likely to work in the so-called gig economy of insecure and non-standard jobs. Many young adults work in these sorts of jobs in retail and hospitality, and 40% of those workers have lost their jobs. Now, there's been the furlough scheme. This has been beneficial. Most people think we as commentators, this is a good thing, but of course it only pays 80% of contracted hours. If you're contracted for 10 hours per week, but typically work 20 hours per week, but your contract is for 10, you'll have to get by on 8 hours pay per week rather than usual 20 hours pay per week. I know this because this is the exact situation that my 19-year-old daughter was in until she lost a job with Topshop. And this, and again, as referred to earlier, there's the problem of the long-term effects of COVID and the pandemic. So as well as the problem of scarring, the impact now on workers in the future, there's also the longer-term impact on the labour market itself. I'm running out of time. Okay, so we know that, for instance, in 3 years' time, according to the Resolution Foundation, 30% the employment rates for young workers will be 30% lower if you're a low-skilled worker. I'll just finish off with one final point, if that's okay. These are obviously very timely and very impressive studies. One of the things I really liked about them was the way that they didn't beat around the bush in their messages and the rigor with which they were carried out. In terms of changing things and how things might change, I very much appreciate and think it's a good idea to be framing messages in terms of a call for the recognition of the key worker. This might help us remember and recognize that work that was done particularly by working class women. You know, we clapped on our doorsteps, children chalked things on the pavements about appreciating key workers, and maybe with that we can remember, or some chance of recognition and remembering of that great solidarity that we had there. And so maybe that is a route that we can look at to give greater value to the role of key workers, and maybe there's some room for optimism and some hope for social change on that point. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob, and I fully agree with you on that last point. And I think it's so important to hear this perspective of, you know, young people through the pandemic too. So our final panelist, I'm going to hand over to Nikki Pound, who is the Women's Officer at the Equalities and Strategies Department of the TUC. So I'll come back at 10 minutes.
Great, thank you very much, Jenny, and great to be here, and thanks to everyone for the great discussion so far. I too am reading from notes on the screen, so I'm not quite sure what your view is of my face, but we'll give it a go. So just to say, the TUC welcomes this excellent research, and I think it once again highlights the need to always look beyond the headline numbers for the different ways the pandemic has impacted and is impacting different groups and their employment and working lives more broadly. We would absolutely agree that the pandemic has exposed existing inequalities and is entrenching them further. And without interventions, these inequalities will persist and worsen, particularly for women, and even more so for working class, BME, young and disabled women, who, as everyone has already said, were already at the sharp end of the labour market going into this crisis. I think even though some of the headline employment trends, such as men's employment being hit worse than women's, do reflect patterns from previous recessions and periods of economic turmoil, on the one hand, we have to reflect on the distinctness of this crisis and what it means for women and building back better. But on the other, we also need to reflect on what we know from previous crises will happen if we don't tackle inequality and insecurity in the labour market. To illustrate this, I just want to draw on the report findings, some trends from other research, and also some of our own TUC analysis, which really supports today's report findings. So, for example, looking at redundancy data during the pandemic, the experiences of men and women today have tracked much more closely than they did during the global financial crisis. Looking at these figures, we can also see that the peak of redundancies so far during the pandemic were higher for both men and women than during the financial crisis. But for women, it was significantly higher, about 76% higher, whereas for men, it was just over 3% higher. As others have mentioned, we know previous crises have led to scarring effects for young workers. In this crisis so far, 6 in 10 job losses in terms of payroll employees have been from young workers, many of whom are young working class women working in the most affected sectors. And we also know that between the financial crisis and the onset of this crisis, while the headline employment rates have been relatively high, when you dig a bit deeper, those headline numbers mask the inequality and precariousness of the labour market, particularly for low-paid and insecure workers, again, where women are overrepresented. Again, just some examples, some research from us on race and Race on the Agenda found that BME women were twice as likely to be on 0 hours contracts than white men. And as the papers we're discussing point out, the employment gap has worsened for BME workers with significant class and gender impacts. We also know before this crisis that BME women had the highest unemployment rate at 6.9%. That was going into the crisis. And as I think Sarah pointed out, that has now risen to nearly 9%. In comparison, pre-crisis to an average of 3.6% unemployment rate for white workers. And also TUC analysis of the labour force survey in November 2020 showed that the employment gap between disabled women and non-disabled men stood at 32.6%. I think we also have to recognise and point to, as this paper does really well, just how important policies like the furlough scheme have been, though they're not perfect. They've helped to mitigate some of the impacts of the pandemic, and they've provided a security net to a lot of workers and industries like accommodation and food and retail, where working class women are overrepresented. We also have to look at how adapting working practices has enabled some people to keep working. And one of the questions I have is, what can we learn from these things to inform what building back better and more equal actually looks like? However, as others have pointed out, it is absolutely vital that we are clear that throughout the pandemic, as this paper highlights, access to some of these things that have helped to mitigate the impact of the pandemic for some have just not been available to others. Further evidence that we already had a multi-tiered labour market and workforce, where access to and enabling participation in the labour market, as well as the quality of your terms and conditions, is very dependent on gender and class, as well as ethnicity and disability. And this has worsened during the crisis. As the report points out, working class women were on the lowest wages of any group. Many of these women are essential and frontline workers. We also know around 70% of the 2 million workers who do not qualify for statutory sick pay because they earn too little are women. As the report notes, many of these women have been more exposed to the health risks of the pandemic because of the nature of their job. Unions throughout this crisis have been highlighting the need for proper risk assessments, adequate PPE, and also the disproportionate risk borne by many working class BME workers due to racism in the workplace. 1 in 6 BME respondents to a survey we did during the pandemic said that they had been put at more risk because of their ethnicity, often being asked to do risky tasks that their white colleagues had refused to do. And as the research highlights, there is a class divide when it comes to flexible working. And I mean flexible working in the sense of the multiple forms it can take, not just working from home. New research actually out today from the TUC backs up the research that we're discussing today. We found that in a poll that we've done that only 23% of those in working class jobs were able to work from home in the pandemic, compared to 60% in higher paid occupations. And 1 in 6 employers said post-pandemic they would not be offering any forms of flexible working to those who were unable to work from home during the pandemic. Similarly, as Sarah noted in her presentation earlier, our research at the start of 2021 found that 7 in 10 requests for furlough from working mums were turned down. As the report highlights, the lion's share of care, homeschooling, domestic work fell to women and reinforced existing gender inequalities. And this has played out in multiple damaging ways for women. Our Working Mums survey showed that many mums regularly were working 14 to 16 hours a day between paid work, domestic chores, and unpaid care and homeschooling, while others saw their hours and income fall significantly with severe financial consequences. Our survey found 1 in 5 mums, mainly those on low pay, had had to drop hours at work or leave the workplace altogether because of caring responsibilities. And as the report highlights, these stresses and anxieties have had a serious impact on women's mental health. Again, in support of the findings of today's research, our Working Mums survey found 9 out of 10 mums said that their mental health had worsened during the pandemic. I think all of this points to the need for clear, targeted policy interventions. Otherwise, we're going to see the labour market continue to become more precarious and less accessible for women, and a two-tiered economic recovery with working class, BME and disabled women particularly affected. We may also see significant long-term scarring for young women who are just entering the labour market, which will hinder their future prospects in terms of earnings, job security and progression, worsening the gender pay gap and the gender pensions gap. As Mandu's story highlighted as well, while this health crisis and its impacts have been unprecedented, a health crisis or a jobs crisis can happen to a person or family at any time. And we must also acknowledge that specific to this crisis, we do not yet know the long-term health impacts in terms of long COVID and the mental and emotional health of people who've been affected. Given what we know women have been through, and we know women have been overrepresented on the front line, we need to make sure we have the resources and the policies in place in our services and in our workplace to deal with the fallout. Just quickly, because I can see Jenny's reappeared, some of the key questions that I think we need to ask are: what happens when furlough ends, and what can we learn more generally from furlough to apply to periods of industrial disruption? What does a good enabling social security system look like? We know there are many problems with universal credit. And also, how do we strengthen workers' rights and choice to autonomy in the workplace to ensure flexible work isn't just seen as working from home and the privilege of a few, but something taken up by women and men across a range of sectors? I do also have a list of policy recommendations, but I'll stop there and we can maybe discuss them more in the discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the Q&A session is absolutely the time to kind of maybe focus a little bit more on those recommendations, because the questions from the first session didn't really kind of engage too much with those, and I think it would be a really good opportunity to do so. So as far as I understand it, that's all of our panelists have had their 10 minutes. So I'd like to invite all of the authors of the reports to kind of turn on their screens so that we can take Q&A. I think that's the plan. And I wondered first if Tracy or Claire or Lewis or Sarah would like to respond to some of the points made by the panelists. Could I perhaps suggest you take a minute each to do that? Starting possibly with Tracy, as I can see her here.
Hi Jenny, thanks. I was still making notes on Nikki's talk because it's just absolutely amazing, and obviously I'll just shut up. Obviously Morris had to go, but that was really wonderful, and one of the things I really one of the many things I wrote down was her emphasis on the longitudinal research, and just in both projects being able to look at before the pandemic and onwards, and in fact in with some of our data sets we have looked back at the recession, at the crisis, the Great Recession, which Nikki talked about. Yeah, I'll shut up about that. Mandu was obviously amazing, and I made a million notes, but I wrote no wriggle room and kind of rounded it up, that wonderful story about, that kind of thin line, and there's just no wriggle. I can't say wriggle, no wriggle room, but it was really great point made. On Rob, thank you, Rob, cheeky sod. I said you could have 1 minute maximum. I wrote down, when you were talking about unemployment, I wrote down underemployment, and I wrote down job precariousness, because I'm really interested in those elements, as you said, and Lewis talked about, going beyond those kind of headline figures. Those headline figures of falling unemployment in the UK have always, hidden what's actually going on in the labour market. Nikki, that was just amazing. I was just wrote down everything that you said, and I'm really interested in, to what TUC is doing in terms of working for kind of, living wages, living hours, and so on. So I'd be really love to hear more. But thank you to the panel.
I would just add, again, thanks to fantastic panel, some really great stuff coming out there. I was also jotting stuff down as well. I'm not going to go through each one. I think for me, Mandu, the story of Aya absolutely spoke to me. I just thought that was amazing. And I think then Rob started talking about young people not being consulted, and that feeling that stuff is happening without them really having a say. And it just struck me that this project is very much a quantitative project. We've had, we've been able to use the most amazing data set that's available, data sets. But, what you're not hearing are the experiences such that Mandu sort of pointed out about Aya, and it really resonated. We've been talking about the numbers and the figures, but when she actually talked about a person and what that person was experiencing, and it's just that need for really good qualitative research, and obviously Jenny's doing something along those lines, so how it is actually affecting individuals. So I've always been a proponent of mixed methods research, but this kind of shouts out to let's hear what these people are saying. And it's interesting because you talk to journalists and they always want to hear case studies. So we've got the figures, but they want to hear about the individuals. They'd like to have the stories. So it's that mix of the two. So thank you for sort of reminding us that we need that. And thanks to the panel and to Jenny. Amazing.
Sarah, is there anything you'd like to add at this stage?
I think in the interest of time and to make sure that we get as many questions as possible, I think I'll leave my comments to the closing remarks, if that's okay.
Sure. So would you like to move into taking questions now? There was one asking, first of all, about whether the impact of the pandemic, or the things that we've been talking about today, what you anticipate will be the likely impact on the gender pay gap. I think, Sarah, if we perhaps start with you on that, in relation to the Women's Budget Group work, and then Tracy or Claire, if you'd like to add anything.
I think there are concerns, definitely, that this will have an impact in kind of widening the gender pay gap, particularly because of what we know has happened to mothers taking on more unpaid work, and so being less able to continue to perform as well as they were doing prior to the pandemic in their paid work. So, you know, those statistics around mothers having less uninterrupted time when they are working from home than fathers, so they were more likely to be doing their paid work, but also at the same time minding a child, or, you know, cooking lunch, or doing multiple tasks at once. And so how that might have had an impact on their paid work and their performance, and therefore also then on their you know, the potential for their progression in their careers, and to be able to accept promotions and be put forward to promotions, all of those things. So there is that concern about that impact on the gender pay gap, definitely. But I think we need more. We probably need more research into how it has been affected in reality.
Sure. Tracy, Claire, do you have anything you want to say? Or perhaps we can come to Nikki or Mandu.
I'm happy to pass across to Nikki, Mandu, about gender pay gap, or anything else that they didn't have a chance to say. Claire,
I can just jump in. I think it would be really interesting to, I mean, there's always this demand, isn't there, for like more granular data, but I think it'd be really interesting to find a way to at least get a sense of, well, there's the gender pay gap as a headline, and then there's the gap between, you know, working class women and middle class women. There is the perpetual story about, well, what's the data and what's the imperative to report on the ethnicity pay gap, you know, cut by gender, as well as the disability pay gap. And so from what your reports tell me, I think you don't really have to be a data scientist to anticipate that there's going to be a pretty harsh, pretty brutal impact that will manifest and materialize with a bit of a lag once the furlough scheme has wound down. And so our vigilance is just going to have to sharpen by a significant degree, literally from November onwards, because I am an optimistic person, but part of the reason why I'm an optimistic person is because I believe you have to actually keep your eye on the ball to be able to anticipate and address the changes that are quite likely. And so I think we've all got a responsibility here to keep on top of that stuff and remember the granularity that's super, super important when discussing big things that people understand now, but it's the devil in the detail, you know?
Yeah, I have to just also come in, but yeah, absolutely agree with everything that Mandu said. And I think that point around how different characteristics intersect is really important. So, you know, one thing that unions are campaigning for, alongside the gender pay gap, which the enforced reporting will start again in October, because we've not had it during the pandemic, is also mandatory ethnicity pay gap reporting and disability pay gap reporting, so that we have this information. I think also one of the things that we've called for is, as much as the reporting on pay gaps is, you know, really great and it really highlights the problem, we need organisations and employers to publish action plans as well, because it's all very well as, you know, as saying what the pay gaps are, but we need to know how people are going to tackle them. And I think, again, that speaks a lot to some of the recommendations in the report and things that we're campaigning on, and I know other panellists are things like, You know, a living wage now will benefit lots of workers, many of them women, and that will help to tackle aspects of the pay gap. We also need to look at, you know, workplace policies. Shared parental leave, like the take up of shared parental leave is really, really poor. And also, what is the access to shared parental leave? As we've said with flexible working, if we do overhaul the shared parental leave system, we don't want it to just be something that only certain people in certain types of jobs get. It needs to be across the board. And, you know, as the Women's Equality Party have been campaigning and leading calls for, investment in childcare is absolutely essential to closing the gender pay gap and the pensions gap. And then, you know, the flexible work discussion and having lots of forms of flexible work, they're all policies that need to happen in order to help close the gap, not just to sort, you know, not to sit alongside reporting what the gap is and how it's progressing.
So one of the questions we have from the audience is, you know, what do the panelists, the authors of the report, think are recommendations that they think will better support, sorry, let me just go back to the question, better support and recognise key workers and essential workers that have made such a significant contribution through the pandemic. I believe, Nikki, you said you had some recommendations that you didn't quite get the opportunity to talk about in your presentation, so maybe we'll go to you first.
Yeah, that would be great, thank you. So I think the first one to sort of, you know, and these are things that I think we need to look at, you know, what can happen now, and what is a longer term, like how do we change our infrastructures, how do we change our support systems? And the first thing is the introduction of a £10 minimum wage. We did some analysis, I think it was the back end of last year, and we found that by raising the minimum wage to £10 an hour now, that would impact about 2 million workers, and many of them are in the private sector. These are people who are in low-paid working class jobs, and again, this is where women are overrepresented. So I think that would be an immediate policy that is within the gift of the government to give. I think on top of that, there's also, we've campaigned a lot around the public sector pay freeze, where we know a lot of women are on the front line in our care and healthcare sectors. And I think, again, we estimated that would impact about 4 million workers by not having public sector pay freeze. So I think they're two kind of immediate policies. I think in general, investment in the care sector, both in terms of health and social care and childcare, again, I think as some of the research findings, and I think your research, Jenny, was pointing out, a lot of women not only need childcare, but they work in childcare, and the pay and conditions in childcare are absolutely terrible. I know the average is just above minimum wage, but in some people, mostly women, are working for less than £5 an hour in some of the more informal settings. I mean, that is just completely unacceptable. So I think, they are things that can really help in driving that. And I think, again, in terms of universal credit, in the immediate, which supports people who are in work and out of work, I think in the immediate term, we need to keep the uplift. And we need to address things like the 5-week wait, which cause a lot of hardship. But we also do need to look at increasing the basic rate, as it's just not livable, and it doesn't support people in work or out of work. It actually often, it does to some extent, but it can really cause hardship for people. And I think longer term, we have to ask, what does an enabling social security system look like, and what are the different purposes of it, and how can we use that to support people, depending on whatever they're going through. So I think there's some key policy areas that would really help address some of those issues.
Can I just do a quick pitch? Can I just do a quick pitch about time as well, as sociologist of time? And obviously, certainly, looking at working class lives, you need the kind of combination of, you need that wage uplift, like Nikki was talking about, so that you can cap the very long hours worked by certainly working class men, which sort of lead into kind of all these kind of gender and class inequalities. And at the same time, you know, provide people with those living hours, which is enough to live on, and as well as enough hours, kind of predictability in those hours, you know, so you're not kind of, you know what your shift's going to be. These are you know, dropped quickly, so the kind of quality time as well as money I've blared on about for many a year.
I should have added, actually, that question was, sorry, I just wanted to kind of, I've seen there's a little slight revision to the question. It was from Susan Himmelwhite, and she said specifically if we could think about care workers in our responses to the question around key working, but I'll hand over to you, Mandu.
I was going to talk about care workers, and I didn't even realize she had revised the question. So sometimes there's a synergy, isn't there? There's obviously this sort of twin track. I think all of us want a massive radical overhaul. Let's start again. Our system's broken, etc. But that's not going to happen overnight. And I do think we don't just sit by and sort of give up in the meantime. And I can just give an example. And this is, you know, I've just fresh come out of campaigning in the elections in the London elections for the Mayor of London campaign. And we were really zooming in on care workers, because one of the things we know is that an outrageous 41% of care workers in London are on 0 hours contracts. So the precarious employment angle is a massive contributor to entrenching the worst parts of the system and the situation that have been described here today. And there are solutions to things like this. For example, you know, I want to see politicians like the Mayor of London. You don't have to be in government to use your power in the right way to do things like say, right, I'm going to incentivize, you know, care providers in our city to pledge using existing mechanisms. For example, the Good Work Standard is a program that the mayor's responsible for, and say, look, if you want to be accredited under the mayor's Good Work Standard, here are the benefits of doing so, but you have to make sure that you no longer rely on 0 hours contracts to employ your workforce. You can do things like bring together local authorities, sympathetic local authorities, more likely to be Labour-run local authorities, let's face it, and they are the ones who do a lot of the commissioning, you know, around care workers. Again, we could put standards and protocols in place that actually pledge and get commitments from these employers to not use or overuse at least zero hours contracts. That starts to shift things a little bit. And I mentioned the tax system. If we want to go now back up to the central government level, we know that in this country, our care system is dominated by private providers. 6 of the richest men in this country have built and accumulated their fortune in the care industry, hiring largely women on poverty wages. Tax breaks could be put in place while we don't have a national care service at the moment. But if you're serious as a government about following what the public wants, which is improving the working conditions and pay for care workers, you could put tax breaks in place that incentivize private care providers to rescind use of 0 hours contracts. It takes a lot of political courage to do that. And I don't know if our government has that, but there are so many solutions that are possible and would make a significant difference to so many of the largely women who work on the front lines in the care profession. And I think the 0 hours contracts, I'm really interested to see Nikki's report that's coming out soon about precarious employment. And Tracy mentioned she's doing some stuff on that as well. I'm hoping there's some good clues in there for all of us and for those in power.
Okay, I really think that ending on the subject of kind of care work and working class women is really crucial. I'm aware that I need to hand over to Sarah, who's going to make some closing comments. Sarah, before I do I have time to just go back to Rob as a panelist? I'm not sure how much time we have. Rob, was there anything you wanted to add to the discussion on this?
Well, I'm listening and making notes, and I would agree with everything that's been said. You know, and Nikki's listing of policy areas really strikes home. And I suppose you know, it's something I wanted to underline as well: the simplicity of the call for the real living wage. You know, some years ago, I was involved in a research project with Tracy Shildrick and colleagues, which was looking over time, longitudinally, the experiences of working class people moving in and out of jobs. The book was called Poverty and Insecurity. We went quite a long way to highlight the problem of the low pay, no pay cycle in-work poverty and so forth. And as it happens, quite a number of the people who took part in that qualitative study were working class women, some of whom were care workers. And of course, you try to boil down policy messages and what are we going to do about all this then, Rob and Tracy? And it's very hard to know sometimes, but if we're looking for one simple message or one simple policy intervention that would have such a dramatic effect, it would be about paying people properly for the work that they do. And the real living wage is something that people know about, something that actually is in place in some areas. So I would underline that as a first point or a first policy area that I think, you know, Nikki so correctly identified.
Thank you. Thank you to all the panelists for your insights and your comments and your thoughts on these recommendations. So I'm going to hand over to Sarah now for the closing comments.
Thank you very much, Jenny, and to all our panelists. So I'm going to be brief and just give a kind of an overview of what was discussed today. So we've seen from the first presentation and really throughout the day that class and income are really a big dividing line when it comes to how COVID impacted our society economically. We heard about how the rigidity and precariousness of working class women's working conditions meant that many weren't able to combine their jobs with the added unpaid work that school closures did. We also seen how many of these working class women are actually frontline workers, so they have been working outside their homes throughout the pandemic, where they were at high risk of catching the virus, but at the same time they were badly protected in health terms and also in financial terms. They were badly rewarded, particularly because their jobs are also low-paid jobs. And on top of this all, we've also seen how working class women have lower chances of progression in their own career than middle class women and men in general. So some working class women are not eligible to sick pay, and this really had a consequence for public health, as I think we all know by now, many workers being unable to self-isolate because they'd struggle to feed their families or pay their bills if they lost this income from their paid work. And on top of that, we've also seen how the working class women absorbed more of the responsibility for unpaid work than their middle class peers and then working class men. But we've also seen how there were other dividing lines when it comes to how COVID impacted, and race was one of them, and how minority ethnic workers were harder hit in terms of higher levels of unemployment and redundancy, and also how younger people and younger women in particular were affected. We've seen how many of these impacts are reflected in other countries too, as Mara shared the Dutch situation. And I think it was particularly interesting to hear about the complex picture that we are seeing now with fathers' involvement throughout in childcare, throughout the lockdowns, and what that might mean for the future. Like others I've already mentioned, I think Mandu's recounting of Aya's story was really a sobering reminder that for many people, COVID was really the last straw. And it was really what pushed many working class women and others off the edge, and how we also heard how the women's sector mobilized to fill gaps that the government support really left behind. And Rob shared his work on the impact of the pandemic on young people, and how, despite we now knowing they were one of the groups hardest hit economically, and the long-lasting consequences that the pandemic will have on their careers, that they have not really been heard when it comes to designing the policy response on this pandemic. And Nikki highlighted some of the recommendations that need to be adopted in order to improve the lives of working class women, who are very often key workers, which we at Women's Budget Group very much agree with, and particularly the investment in the care industries. You know, it's really not enough to just raise the minimum wage without also increasing investment in these lower paid sectors like childcare, social care as well, because if we don't do that, then what we'll see is more nurseries, more social care providers struggling with the costs of providing these services. And really, I think this is very timely that just this week there was a report from the Early Years Alliance about how the free entitlement hours on childcare are underfunded, and apparently knowingly so by the government, and how that really forces providers, childcare providers, to then cross-subsidize by putting up fees for younger children. So to really wrap up, this study on working class women has really been an important one. It's using rigorous data from the Labour Force Survey, the Understanding Society Survey, to understand the experiences of working class women and how they've differed from working class men and middle class women. The next project of the team will be on precarious employment, and hopefully we'll be reporting its first findings in July. So I think really we need to keep banging the drum of giving greater value to key workers, and at WBG we will certainly keep banging the drum of the importance of a care-led recovery, that any plans to build back better need to not just fix our broken social care and childcare sectors, but that these sectors need to be central in such a recovery, and investment in them a key part of it, as recognition of the foundational sectors that they really are in our society and economy. So I would just like to thank everyone very much who have attended today, and thank very much to our brilliant speakers as well for their informative and passionate presentations. Just to let everyone know that we will be uploading the recording of the session to our website and share the PowerPoints with everyone as well. Yeah, so thank you very much.